up against half-price movies at Silver Spot. So if anybody came.
Oh yeah, that's
lost you.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
But is there anything important on like that?
Well, there must be something critically important. So, you know, my book, Adaptable, goes through your whole body, how it works, why it's important. And so to sort of wrap your arms around that and think about how I would talk through that in a half hour or even longer if I had the time. It's hard to imagine how to do that without kind of getting this rambling sort of multi-system talk, because the book covers everything. So what I thought I would do is I would talk about it instead in terms of the way that our body has layers of adaptation kind of built in. Everything from 2 billion years old stuff to stuff that's happened since you were born to stuff that's happening right now. You're making millions of red blood cells every second, right? As we sit here. And so one way to kind of think through that is to just imagine your trajectory here from the earliest single-celled stuff all the way through today, and you can kind of touch on all of a number of big touchstones just by taking a breath. So everybody can do that with me. Just close your eyes, take a breath. And as we do that, actually, you are hitting on over about 2 billion years of evolutionary history, all the way up through, what you did this morning. It really compounds everything. So, for example, why do we breathe at all? Right? Why do you have to breathe? Not everything breathes. Trees don't breathe. Right? Single-cell organisms don't breathe. So why do we breathe? If this isn't interactive, it's going to get really painful. So go ahead, just shout it out. Why do we breathe? To get oxygen, right? So ADP, right? So, but actually using oxygen is that's an adaptation to the fact that about 3 billion years ago, plants started figuring out how to do photosynthesis and created all this oxygen in the atmosphere, which is really destructive. And so it wasn't until about 1.8 billion years ago that some single-cell organisms that are our ancestors brought these mitochondria on board, these bacteria, and they can use oxygen to make ATP. And so we are the descendants of that. So that the mitochondria in your body, the fact that you use oxygen, is a 1.8 billion year old adaptation. And then here's the fun part. Anybody know where the oxygen goes? It doesn't just build up, right? Where does it go when you're done with it?
Back out.
You don't breathe it. Well, you breathe out the stuff that you don't use. So you breathe in about 20% oxygen. You breathe out 16% oxygen. So some of it never gets in. But the stuff that gets in there, where does it go?
Bones and teeth.
No.
No.
Well,
Not the breathing.
Yeah, not the breathing stuff. Yeah.
Except for some
That's okay.
bones and teeth. Your brain.
Yeah, it's going to go to your brain, but it's going to go to the mitochondria in your brain. What are they going to do with it? Well, it turns out it gets turned into water. So we're producing water. We produce about a cup of water every day. And if you think about all the water that everything that's ever used mitochondria has ever produced in the history of the planet, we've recycled all of Earth's water like 100 times. I think actually more than that. So, so you make ATP with the oxygen, but you also make water, and so you pee it out, right? So you breathe oxygen, and it ends up getting in your bloodstream as water, and then filtered out through your kidneys. And so, just that trip, just traveling along with an oxygen molecule tells you all about your physiology. Here's a question. Why do we breathe in and out of our mouths? That's your food hole. Why do you breathe in and out of your food hole?
That was not very efficient.
It's kind of dumb, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why would you wouldn't design it that way because you didn't design it that way. The answer for that is that we breathe out of our mouths, as we can, because lungs are evolved swim bladders of fish. So the swim bladders are what fish fill with air to be able to keep them neutrally buoyant in whatever part of the water column they want to be in. And it's part of their digestive system. So when your lungs develop, they develop as part of your digestive system in embryology.
Wow.
Right. So if you understand a little bit about embryology and the history of that, you understand why you have that. So your lungs are actually part of your digestive system, sort of, kind of. But then that sounds really dumb because then you could choke. But not all animals choke. Right? It's a pretty rare thing to actually have that. So why do we choke? Why do we choke so easily?
We just have that one.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's just the one thing, and it's because we're evolved to talk. And so language has been so valuable an adaptation. So the adaptation of language is put our larynx down deep on our throat, and because of that, we have the risk of choking. So here's, let me see if this will work the way I want it to do. By the way, does anybody recognize the woman in the?
Is that Janice?
No, it's AI generated. So if anybody said they recognized it, I was going to say. All right, so here's this is Janice, by the way.
No, it's not.
When she's sleeping, I take an MRI of her. There we go. So you can tell what's going on, I think. Creepy.
Married to a scientist.
Yeah. So obviously, nose, lips, mouth. You can see the black spaces are air because MRI, and so the larynx is there with the little yellow dot.
All'alba vincerò,
Isn't that cool?
vincerò, vincerò.
I don't know what he's singing. Claire asked me that. What's he singing? I have no idea. It's in Italian. But what's cool about this is you can see, right? There's a vertical component of those vocal tracts. So that's the larynx right there. Larynx is the noise generator, and it's in at the top of your trachea as well. You squeeze air through your voice box, and the vocal folds go, and that's how you make the energy that you make noise with. And to be able to make human-like speech, you have to have a vertical part of your vocal tract and a horizontal part. And you shape those two things separately, differently, and that's how you get vowel sounds and all kinds of sounds that speech has. And so it's been so valuable in terms of reproductive success and evolutionary success to be able to make human-like speech that we've adapted to have this larynx down way deep in our throat. Even though what that means is every time you swallow food or water, you take a big chance of choking to death. 5,000 people a year die in the U.S. from choking. But that's the evolutionary trade-off. And then why do you talk like you, Ryan? And the answer is all the things that have happened since you've been born, right? So all those things we just talked about are all true for everybody, but each of us has a different voice, and it's because of the way that we grew up. So they have these sort of like adaptations and changes that have happened afterward. So, for example, voice pitch. All babies, like Keon, who was here a minute ago, all have the same voice pitch when they're born, and it drops as they get bigger because the size of your larynx tells you, it dictates how deep your voice is. And so when they're tiny little babies, they have high-pitched baby voices, and it comes down, down, down. And then at puberty, right, if you have testosterone as your main reproductive hormone, it thickens the vocal folds and makes the larynx grow, and you end up with, on average, a much lower pitched voice. And if you don't have testosterone, you end up with a much higher pitched voice. And so if you look at males and females today, as adults, I should say, that's the distribution of voice pitch. So part of the reason why you speak the way you do is your developmental biology. That, by the way, is in a snapshot, the biology of the underlying the sort of arguments around, sex and gender and participation in female categories for sports, because in a lot of measures like grip strength and upper body strength and that kind of stuff, you see this kind of separation of male and female distributions.
How does accent affect,
Huh?
How does
Well,
accent affect this?
Accents, because you are amazing. People are very good at mimicking what they grew up with, and from the actual language you speak to the way you speak it, is you're just mimicking the sounds you hear growing up. And then there's also this fun cultural stuff, like if you look at voice pitch again, the difference between male and female pitch in the U.S., for example, isn't quite as dispersed as the average male and female in Japan. So for whatever reason, culturally, there's more, people are sort of training themselves to speak a bit higher, a bit lower, is the argument. So anyway, culture and environment also obviously has a big effect. So everything from 1.8 billion years till literally the way that, I know that I don't speak the way I grew up speaking. I had a much thicker Western Pennsylvania accent. I still have a little bit of one, but less so. And so, we're always adapting to our environment that way. All right. A lot of the book kind of uses the amazing diversity of human cultures that we have to ask the question about how humans adapt to different environments. And so one question we can ask is what happens when oxygen is scarce? And, our adaptability is our original human superpower, that I would argue. And one of the things that kind of makes our biology unite us. And so this is a really well-studied situation in anthropology, this adaptation to high altitude. And there's Himalayan studies and Andean studies. And what they show is that if you look at, for example, hemoglobin concentration, these are independent events, right? The group that moved up into the Andes, that's a completely separate phenomenon than the group that moved up into the Himalayas. And so it's sort of evolution having two chances to answer the same question, which is how are you going to deal with low oxygen? In the Andean situation, they respond by having higher hemoglobin concentrations than you would if you were at sea level. In the I have it backwards. In the Andeans have higher hemoglobin. That's the molecule that holds oxygen in your red blood cells. Himalayans have bigger lung volumes. There's another fun example of this, which is the Sama sea nomad. So there's a group of folks that live in Oceania, in the South Pacific, and they spend their lives, large parts of their lives, at sea. Men forage for fish underwater. They just hold their breaths and go down. And so it's the same kind of problem that you have if you go to altitude, which is how do you survive long periods with low amounts of oxygen. And in these guys, you see this really cool local adaptation of having larger spleens. So your spleen is this little reserve tank of red blood cells. We would actually see bigger spleens in the Himalayan groups and the Andean groups as well, for example, because if you grow up with low oxygen around, your spleen will get a little bit bigger. So a lifespan adaptability component to that. But with the Sama, they're also called the Bajau, but they prefer to be called the Sama. There's actually genetic adaptations, genetic variants that increase their spleen size have been favored. And so population-wide, they have larger spleens in the Sama because they have this reserved red blood cell tank then for when they die.
What about women? They don't go under the water.
No, but everybody, it's another, men and women's spleens have the same, growth. There aren't separate genes for women's and men's spleens, so they'll have larger spleens too. Yeah. And so one of the things that I've focused on a lot, and folks, you probably all know this, but is how much energy do you need every day? So how much oxygen do you need to move through your body every day? And how does that change with modernization, right? And so I think everybody here's heard versions of this story before, but
I'll tell it again.
I'll tell it again. The way we get into this is with the Hadza energetic study. And for those who don't know, the Hadza are a hunter-gatherer group in northern Tanzania. And when we work with them, it's this sort of big camping trip. I'm about to take my family out to come see parts of this part of Tanzania this summer, so that'll be exciting. This is what we're going to do. We're going to pack into these two Land Rovers, and with all this stuff, and we're going to make Brian Wood pack everything up for us. That's going to be the new one. And we go out there and we do a lot of community engagement, obviously, because you can't do this sort of work by just parachuting in. But Brian Wood especially has been working with these guys for years and years, decades now. And so here's a Hadza camp. You see some houses there. Folks who happen to be there in the middle of the day when we rolled up. There's Brian talking about the kind of work we want to do on that trip. We set up our research camp there. And, we kind of follow along throughout the course of their day. Yeah.
Question on that, because I've seen some of your photos and just in general, like that Central Valley. There's lots of leafless, scrabbly looking things.
Yeah.
Is that a seasonal thing, or are they burned, or? Because it seems very common in the backdrop. I don't know.
So some of it is, these are typically dry season pictures because I've typically gone in the summers. I was there in one fall. I was there in October, November one year, and it was more kind of green and more leaves on trees because the rainy season had just ended. I get 2 rainy seasons and 2 dry seasons a year. And so, a lot of these pictures, all of them here, I think, are going to be from dry season. So the trees do look a little scrubby. It's true. But also, I think they just kind of grow that way. These are pretty hardy trees that don't have like big lush leaves. They just can't get away with it because it's too dry. So yeah, spend your time following and walking. They walk a lot, as you can imagine. Women get about 13,000 steps a day.
Yes.
And when they're with a kid on their back, they're picking berries. Sometimes they're digging. What's that now?
That's me.
That's you?
Yeah.
On the back or digging with a stick?
On the back.
Oh, okay. Well, he's only like a year and a half old, so I don't know if 10 years old kids. I think they gotta walk.
Yeah, bigger than.
Yeah, that's right. There it is. That's a tuber digging party. Oh, let's see, that kid's learning how to do it. There. Yeah. Anyway, it's hard work, man. And they share everything. These big tuber roasting parties when they come back to camp. That's the tuber right there. That's how like fibery and low starch it is. You wish it was starchier.
How does that taste?
It tastes kind of like eating. It's like a potato-ish. Actually, a little sweeter than potatoes. But you kind of chew them up and then spit out the fibers because there's too much fiber to it. You could swallow it. It doesn't hurt you, but you wouldn't. You spit up. You just chew it and chew it and then spit it out.
Has anyone fermented?
They don't make any alcoholic stuff that way. And in fact, they also get a lot of honey, and there are local groups next to them that will use the honey to make like a mead, I guess. But they don't make any alcohol themselves. But they will drink alcohol. They're not against it, but they don't. This is baobab, another big thing. They get these big baobab pods, and they get the kernels in them, and they pound them down into meal. Men walk about 19,000 steps a day, on average 12 kilometers a day. So the hunting with bow and arrow, they make themselves. Here's a hot guy making an arrow. I think this is so cool. So he's got like sinew that he's pulled off of muscle from a previous kill. And he's using that to kind of wind on like a thread to kind of wind and glue on the feathers on this arrow. And what they'll say is that you always want to get feathers from both the left wing and the right wing of the bird. If you only have left wing arrows, it'll go left. If you only have right wing, right wing feathers, it'll go. So here's a successful kill. It's impala here. You can see it's incredibly hard to do what they do. That they will shoot an animal, and then they'll let it run and let the poison work, and then they track it afterwards. And it's like magic watching these guys do that kind of work. It's an incredibly sophisticated skill to learn how to do. And there you go. This is sort of out of order, but and I like to point this out. This guy has a Nature Conservancy shirt on. All those clothes that you give away end up somewhere. Sometimes they end up in Africa, and you can end up with a Nature Conservancy shirt on a guy who's just killed an impala. It makes me laugh every time. Yeah, that's how. There's no way they don't have like backpacks and stuff, so you just carry it home. That's the hide of the animal, and they have all the guts and stuff, all the internal organs that they'll eat wrapped up in there, and he's going home with that. He's obviously got a leg there. And then they climb these trees. They use these axes to pound these pegs into the tree and go up into these big baobab trees and get honey. And honey can be 15 to 20% of the diet on average in terms of calories eaten. There's some kids learning how to dig tubers with mom. And of course, the sharing's a big piece of this. There's a lot of intergenerational sharing, so it's a big communal activity. And people have been hunting and gathering for over 2 million years. Since before we were Homo sapiens, and it's that it produces a lot more calories than just hunting or gathering alone would, and so there's excess calories to share to younger generations. It actually is the engine behind long childhoods, because you can have a long childhood of dependency where adults can feed you because adults are so productive being hunter-gatherers and being able to share their food. So it's like the human adaptation. And so we wanted to know, when we did this study, how many calories you burn every day. And so the hods are much more physically active. They get about 2 hours of activity a day, much more than anybody else does that you probably know. They get more activity in a day than a typical American gets in a week. And so we wanted to know how many calories they burn every day. And so we used this isotope tracking technique called double labeled water. And to our huge surprise, we expected them to have really high expenditures. Instead, here's what we found. If you look at body size on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, and how many calories they burn on the y-axis, every dot here's a person. The open symbols are women and the closed symbols are men. You can see the Hadza they just fall right on top of this data set for everybody else. So the gray dots are people from the US and other industrialized economies. The red are Hadza. And so there was no difference between Hadza energy expenditures and energy expenditures in a much more sedentary, industrialized environments. It's a big surprise. And so we spent the next sort of 10 years or so replicating that in other environments. So the Hadza, we were able to show that with them. We asked the same question with a group called the Dasnich in northern Kenya. They're pastoralists. This study just came out last year, actually. Same story. They're really physically active, same energy expenditure every day as folks in the US, Europe, other industrialized places. The Shuar in Ecuador, hunting and gathering and farming, and same energy expenditures as kids in the US and the UK. That was a study of children specifically. Amy Luke's work in Nigeria showed women in the farming communities in Nigeria have the same energy expenditures as age and size, age, body size matched women in Maywood, Illinois. And we did this work with the Chimani group in Bolivia as well, another kind of farming, foraging group. Same story, again and again and again. Really physically active populations do not necessarily burn more calories. Sometimes they do, but it's really variable, and there's no consistent signal of high expenditure just from activity levels there. So what do we think is going on? We think this is what's happening. Imagine you have two people that are equally sedentary, and so they spend, this represents how many calories they burn every day, and some portion of that's on activity, and some portion of it is on everything else. And so the guy on the right decides to be more physically active, start an exercise program, and for a while, right, his activity expenditure goes up, and so everything goes up. And that's what we see. If we look at people who do an exercise intervention program, if we dose them with 200 calories of exercise a day, and we measure the change from baseline, we'll see that it'll go up 200 calories a day, their total expenditure. But what happens is over time, if we go back and check in at 6 months or a year, we see that most of that, in many cases, expenditure has been sort of carved back, pulled back. And so what's happening is the body seems to be figuring out ways to save energy in non-activity tasks. The activity still costs what it costs. There's not any kind of magic there. But the body is somehow reducing its energy expenditure on all these other tasks. And that's probably a really good thing, because that's, we think, one of the reasons that you have less inflammation, less stress reactivity, sort of lower cortisol and epinephrine and adrenaline levels, and sort of more moderated levels of things like testosterone for males or estrogen and progesterone for females. Those are all good things health-wise. So all those adjustments are reasons that exercise is so good for your health, but it's also a reason that it makes it hard to sort of use exercise to manage your weight, because it doesn't boost your metabolism the way you think it does. Okay, guys? Hope you can find us. All right. And so, why should we care about how our bodies work? If we can track oxygen through our bodies, track all these adaptations, we can understand how our metabolism works. Well, I think the metabolism story is one great example of why we should care. Because if we don't really understand how our bodies work, then we're not going to really understand how we can manage things like weight, which is a really important variable for health. But one of the things I try to do with the book is go system by system and talk about all the ways in which the ways that we understand how our bodies work touch on all these really sort of big issues in our world today. And so, we think about questions about, sex and gender, things about IQ, things about disparities in health outcomes, all the biohacking, the enormous amount of biohacking and social media influencing in health that's out there. Questions about reproductive health, reproductive rights, vaccines, right? All of these really hot button issues are fundamentally, I think, sort of touch on and are founded on the way that we understand our bodies, right? So we can't really have a sort of evidence-based foundation for thinking about these things, these big issues, We don't understand how our bodies work to begin with. And so that's what I think is the strongest case for why this is so essential to know, is that we can't really engage in these conversations without that background. So the book doesn't talk about sort of how you ought to think about these things. That's up to you. But it does, I think, try to offer a sort of common ground or an evidence base for us all to have these conversations. So yeah, understand your body, understand your world. That's the goal of the book. Really appreciate everybody coming. Thanks so much. And that's it.
What about the people who are saying that they are now figuring out ways to keep us from aging? How does that relate to what you're talking about?
Yeah, so that's talk about that in the book. The question about can you sort of live forever? Can you just sort of push aging forever and ever? To live longer or to maximize your lifespan, you kind of have to do two things. The first thing you have to do is try to avoid all the lifestyle diseases that we know how to avoid. So, heart disease, cancer, those are lifestyle affected diseases, environmentally affected diseases that we can do something about. We can not smoke. We can eat a healthy diet and keep a healthy weight. Cancer there's an element of luck to cancer, because every time you get a cell, your cells are dividing so often that you're making 2 miles of DNA every second, which is kind of crazy to think about. But so errors in that are kind of inevitable, and so you always have some risk of developing cancers. But there are environmental ways that you can, between diet and lifestyle, that you can kind of minimize your risk. So you have to sort of play that game. Try to have a healthy lifestyle, get enough sleep, all the things that we know how to do. And if you do that, you have a very good chance of making it to 70s or 80s. Beyond that, it's genetics, right? Because we are also, all organisms are kind of, built into our genetics is aging and senescence, right? And so I don't think there's any way to sort of mess with that without like a wholesale change in the way our genetics are organized. And the idea that we could sort of somehow live twice as long as we do now is probably the same kind of magical thinking as believing that we could somehow engineer ourselves to be twice as tall, right? It's unlikely to happen. And if you did change your genetics that way, probably have all kinds of crazy knock-on effects that we can't anticipate. So I think the lifestyle stuff and trying to maximize your health span is the best you can do. I think the promises of aging in reverse or some of these things you hear about online, I think that's too good to be true.
Darn.
Yeah, sorry.
TikTok.
Yeah, I know. Although if you're a billionaire, apparently you can get, and you have a son, so you can transfuse your blood with your son's blood. Yeah, people do it.
Why is it that expensive?
I think you have to pay doctors to do it.
Who will do it?
Who will do it? Yeah.
Why do you want to do that in the first place?
There's some interesting studies in mice that if you take old mice and you completely transfuse them with young mice's blood, all of a sudden they do great.
Is that right, Lucky? Did you do that, Lucky?
Yeah.
I want to suck your one blood.
Yeah.
I'm good.
Yeah.
They do great. Like,
Alex agreed to do it for Herman.
Yeah.
Really?
Sure. What does that mean? Just 1 unit?
They are more vibrant.
More vibrant?
Yes. The wrinkles go away.
Vibrant? Is that true?
Yeah.
It's not. Lucky, did you hear that?
I think I've got a runaway.
That's what I want my birthday.
You want his blood?
Yeah, only the son's, isn't it? The daughter's blood.
No, I was saying because the guy who's famous for doing this, he did it from his son. But I think you could.
Hello. That's good to know.
Was the son okay?
Well, I don't think they take. I see it. No, I don't think so. But I also don't know that they I think when they do it in the mice, they fully transfuse the mouse.
The whole night, all of it.
I think that's.
What blood is that?
Do you kill the son then?
Well, with a mouse experiment, they don't worry about it. But in a human experiment, yeah.
Only one way to find out.
Yeah. You need about 6 liters of blood to really do a full swap.
6 liters.
Yeah.
That's a lot. That's a lot.
Yeah, it's not a small amount.
Liters is a gallon.
Oh my God.
So
Oh,
if
bye bye, Lucky.
if it takes 6 liters to do the transfusion, put into perspective, how many liters of blood do you have to lose to die?
Yeah, how many what percentage?
2 liters of blood and you're in deep trouble.
Oh.
Yeah.
You feel like all they can give the whole blood.
Yeah, right.
What if they give the whole blood to the
Since
son?
we're all on this, how often do you do that?
To be clear, I don't think it had any real serious effects for the guy. So I'm not promoting it, but
Sounds like you are.
yeah.
It's on recording.
But I also do have a startup I'd like you guys to think about. I'm excited about it. Yeah, no. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
Does
but
anybody else?
Alice, please.
You have questions?
Go ahead.
I was just fascinated. Can you give just a quick, maybe
Sure.
2 sentences about, are we smart enough to understand intelligence?
Oh, that's a good one. And
I've often wondered about that.
yeah, so there are all kinds of like there's the spleen. So, where to back up? Humans have been co-evolving with our cultures, unlike any other species. So we have what we call like a dual inheritance. Other species have cultures and learn from each other. At least some people argue they have culture. I don't know. They have social learning. But humans are far and away, unique in having this sort of rich cultural environment that we live in. And so, for example, and it affects our biology in interesting ways. So, for example, there is no gene for making fire, right? That has to be passed on as knowledge as part of the culture. But our bodies need cooked food. We've evolved to need cooked food, actually, and not do well if we don't cook our food. So our biology and our culture are actually completely interdependent that way. And your brain's kind of like that. So your brain is born into the world only a third the size it will end up being. And it is completely unfinished and has to get filled with all these things you need to learn how to. So you're built to learn. And actually your brain is incredibly energy expensive for the first sort of 5-6 years of your life. It takes up a huge amount of your resting energy expenditure. Just plugging in synapses and unplugging them and that kind of thing. So your neurons are very busy. All that said, by the time we get to around to where we could test an IQ, whatever that means, right? We're already into the fully environmentally formed brain, right? There is no such thing as non-environmentally shaped brain. And so the question about, can we really understand IQ? Yeah, we can do IQ tests on kids and on adults, and it's a repeatable measure. Whatever we are measuring with an IQ test, it's repeatable over time. And it is true that, if you do twin studies or you do genetic studies, there is some genetic component to IQ test. Whatever it's measuring is tracking something to do with genetics as well as environment, we know. But the idea that we would be able to sort of isolate the genetic component of IQ against the environmental component is sort of probably impossible. Because to do that, you would have to raise humans like mice. You'd have to clone them and have perfectly controlled environments and perfectly controlled genetics to really be able to parse that apart. And you'll never be able to do that with humans. And so the best we can say, probably the best we can ever say, is there is some genetic component to how well you do on an IQ test. It seems to be much smaller than the environmental influence on how well you do in an IQ test. And then when you get to the really contentious ideas about how groups compare, which is the way that the IQ tests have been used since their inception, actually, is trying to talk about group differences. There, I think you can't say anything about the genetics of that because there is such an environmental piece to it, and there will always be, because you can't test a brain that hasn't environmentally been shaped. That when you are looking at between group differences, you are basically just comparing environmental differences in the way that kid's been trained to take an IQ test, essentially. So that's where I come down at the end of the book. And
what about memory?
Well, I think you'd have the same.
Which way does memory go?
I think you'd have the same sort of story there. There's probably a genetic component to it, and also there's going to be an environmental component to it as well.
Yeah, I taught it. So
yeah,
in school.
Totally.
Lots of IQ tests. So.
Yeah, right. All right, guys.
Why? That's why I was curious.
Yeah, no, of course.
I have a question.
Yes, Luke.
Can you sign my shirt?
I can sign your
Can you
shirt.
autograph my shirt, please?
Yes. I don't know on that particular shirt. I don't know if it's possible, but I will do my best. All right. Thanks, everybody.